The doors shattered inward at 12:17 a.m. Two men in black balaclavas came through the emergency entrance of Harrowvale Medical Center, firing live rounds, and the screaming started before the glass finished falling. Patients dove from gurneys. A paramedic slammed his shoulder into a supply cart trying to run. Three nurses flattened themselves against the wall behind the intake desk, hands over their heads, and not one of them moved. One person walked toward the gunfire. She wasn't a security guard. She wasn't armed. She was wearing navy blue scrubs with a stain from a coffee spill near the left pocket, and everyone who worked the night shift at Harrowvale knew her as the quiet one. The nurse who never argued, never pushed back, and never made anyone feel like she was something more than exactly what she appeared to be. Her name was Mara Solis, and she was the only person in that building who already knew how this night was going to go. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change the way you see the people standing quietly in the background. Hit like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The 11 p.m. shift at Harrowvale Medical Center was, by any reasonable standard, already a bad one before the gunmen arrived. A three-car accident on Route 9 had pushed the ER past capacity by 9:30, and by 11 the waiting room was standing room only. 2 broken arms, 1 possible spinal fracture, a child with a fever of 104 who wouldn't stop crying, and an elderly man in a paper gown sitting in a corner chair who nobody had gotten to yet because the board was full and the staff was stretched past the point of polite. The hallways smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and the particular human exhaustion that sets in around hour 6 of a 12-hour shift. Mara Solis had been on her feet since 3 in the afternoon. She was not the kind of nurse who complained about it, not because she was saintly or particularly cheerful, she wasn't either, but because she had learned a long time ago that fatigue was information, not a problem. You noted it, you adjusted, you kept moving. She had spent 4 years learning that in environments where losing track of your body's limits could get people killed, and the muscle memory of it had never fully left her, even now, even in blue scrubs in a civilian hospital that smelled like floor cleaner and microwave soup. She was charting in the corridor outside room 6, when Dr. Prescott came around the corner with the specific expression she had come to associate with someone who wanted to delegate something unpleasant. Dr. Nolan Prescott was the overnight attending and the kind of doctor who had spent enough years being the smartest person in whatever room he entered that he'd stopped double-checking that assumption. He was capable, she'd give him that. He was fast, he was accurate in a crisis, and he had genuinely good instincts when the pressure was on. He was also condescending in the particular way that men who had never been doubted often were, not cruelly, just reflexively, the way you'd explain a new parking meter to someone who'd never seen one. "Solis," he said, "I need someone to manage the waiting room intake for the next hour. Carla's with the spinal case and Demi called out sick." Mara glanced at her current chart. Room 6 had a patient, 53-year-old woman, presenting chest tightness, elevated BP, possible early MI, who she had flagged twice in the last 40 minutes for escalating symptoms. She'd left notes. She'd told the charge desk. Nobody had pulled the attending yet. "I can do that," she said carefully, "but Mrs. Tavares in 6 needs someone to watch her more closely. Her pressure's been climbing since 9 and she's starting to show. I'll have someone check on her." He was already turning away. "Waiting room, please." It was not the first. It would not be the last. Mara had learned to pick her battles in this place, not because she was passive, but because she understood the difference between a hill worth dying on and a procedural argument with an attending who was already 3 steps down the hallway. She flagged Mrs. Tavares a 3rd time in the system, made a note in the chart that was as specific and time-stamped as she could make it, and walked to the waiting room. The waiting room at 11 p.m. was a particular kind of misery. The overhead lights were the color of old teeth. A television mounted in the corner played a cable news channel that nobody was watching. The child with the fever had finally fallen asleep on her mother's lap, but her breathing was fast and shallow in a way that Mara clocked from 20 feet away and filed. She introduced herself to the front desk volunteer, a young man named Tobias, who looked like he'd been awake since yesterday and was running on something caffeinated and regret, and started working the room methodically. She wasn't doing intake in the official sense. She was triaging the waiting, which was a different thing. She was reading the room the way she had learned to read a lot of environments, quickly, without drawing attention to herself, noting who was deteriorating and who was stable and who needed to be moved up the list before they became a code. The elderly man in the corner she reached last. He was sitting very still with his hands folded in his lap, and he looked at her when she crouched down to his level with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to be spoken to. "How long have you been sitting here?" she asked. "Since 8, he said. His voice was quiet and a little dry. "They told me someone would come." His name was Bernard Fike, and he was 71, and his left arm had a particular gray quality to it that she recognized immediately. She was already reaching for his wrist before she'd fully registered making the decision. His pulse was weak and irregular. "Bernard," she said, "I need you to come with me right now. Can you walk?" "I can walk," he said, with the dignity of a man who had not yet decided to admit how bad he felt. She walked him to the corridor herself, flagged down a passing tech, and told her to get a crash cart to exam 4 because she had a possible MI who had been sitting in the waiting room for 3 hours. The tech looked at her with the brief, assessing glance that was the particular specialty of night shift people trying to determine whether an alarm was real, and then saw something in Mara's face and moved. Mara got Bernard Fike settled and was pulling leads when Dr. Prescott appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who had been surprised. "Solis, what are you—" "Possible MI," she said, without turning around. 3 hours in the waiting room, pulse irregular, left side symptoms. "I need an EKG, and I need it now." There was a pause. "You were supposed to be doing intake." "I was doing intake," she said. "He was the intake." Prescott moved past her to the patient without arguing further, which she took as provisional agreement. She finished attaching the leads, stepped back, and let him take over, which was how it was supposed to work. And she understood that. But there was still the specific friction of stepping back when she had been the one to see it, the one to act, the one to catch what everyone else had missed. She went back to the corridor and stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a hospital hallway at 11:15 p.m. and breathed. The thing nobody at Harrowvale knew about Mara Solis, the thing she had not offered and nobody had thought to ask, was that she had spent 4 years attached to a special operations medical detachment operating in 3 different countries, doing trauma care in conditions that most emergency room physicians would not have recognized as medicine at all. She had triaged casualties in vehicles moving at speed. She had performed surgical interventions in buildings without electricity, in temperatures that fogged her breath, with whatever was in her kit and whatever her hands could do. She had been part of something classified enough that her discharge papers listed her specialty as general medical support, and her commanding officer had told her, the day she separated, that most of what she'd done would never appear on any record anywhere. She had not argued with that. She had come home, taken a civilian nursing certification that felt almost comically basic given what she'd actually spent 4 years doing, and accepted a night shift position at Harrowvale because it was close to her apartment, and the hours didn't require her to be cheerful in the morning. She was 31 years old. She owned 4 sets of Navy scrubs, a reliable car, and a very old coffee maker that she had not replaced even though it took 7 minutes to produce a cup, because she'd had it since before she deployed, and she saw no reason to get rid of things that still worked. She was not looking for recognition. She was not performing humility. She had simply made a decision, when she came back, to be quiet, to do the work, to not require people to understand her. It was a decision that worked better some nights than others. At 11:43, the charge nurse, a woman named Deborah Haas, who had been running this floor for 11 years and ran it the way a very competent person runs something they have slightly outgrown, stopped Mara in the corridor to tell her that Mrs. Tavares in room 6 was asking for her specifically. "Prescott's attending," Mara said. "I know. She wants you." Mara went. Mrs. Tavares was a small woman with dark hair threaded with gray who had arrived 8 hours ago complaining of what she'd described as pressure, like someone sitting on my chest, and who had been classified as stable observation for most of that time. She was sitting upright in the bed now, which was different from how Mara had left her, and her color was wrong. "Hey," Mara said quietly, and came to the side of the bed and took her hand. "How are you feeling right now?" "Worse," Mrs. Tavares said. She said it simply, without drama, the way someone states a fact they wish weren't true. Mara looked at the monitor. Pressure had climbed 8 points in the last 40 minutes. She pulled out her pen and pressed 2 fingers gently against the woman's wrist, then her neck, reading what the machines couldn't contextualize. "I'm going to get Dr. Prescott," she said. "I want you to stay exactly like this, okay? Don't lie down." She found Prescott 20 feet away, explained what she'd seen with the brevity of someone who had learned to give information in the time available. He listened. He did not fully dismiss her. He went to look, which was the correct response, but she caught the edge of the expression he wore when she said the word worsening, the slight recalibration behind his eyes that meant he was adjusting from her assessment to what he would find when he got there, as if those were likely to be different things. They were not different things. He ordered additional tests 20 minutes later and upgraded Mrs. Tavares to monitored status, which was what Mara had been asking for since 9 o'clock. She said nothing about that. She documented it. She was back at the nurse's station at 12:11 a.m., updating charts, when she heard the sound. It was not loud at first. It was the sound of a vehicle moving faster than vehicles move through a hospital parking lot, and then tires on pavement, and then something that might have been voices, and then it was very loud, very fast. The particular percussion of an impact that was not mechanical, not an accident, but intentional, and she was on her feet before the sound registered consciously, body already cataloging what she'd heard while her brain was still catching up. The emergency entrance was 40 feet down the corridor. She heard the glass first, then the screaming started. She was already moving. The scene at the entrance was this: 2 men, balaclavas, one with a rifle and one with a handgun, both firing. The rifle into the ceiling in what she read immediately as a crowd-control discharge, not a kill shot. The handgun aimed lower and more deliberate. A security guard named Marcus, who she recognized, was down behind the reception desk with his hands over his head and his radio in his hand, not shot, just flattened. A paramedic team had abandoned their gurney, empty, thank everything, and was running. Patients were screaming, dropping, trying to get under chairs and behind anything that would put mass between them and the noise. Mara stopped running. She stood in the corridor just back from the entrance, at the edge of the chaos, and assessed. She had been in rooms with guns before. The fear was still there. She was not pretending it wasn't. It was a real physical thing that lived in the chest and pressed against the lungs. But she had learned that fear and function were not mutually exclusive. You could be afraid and still read the room. You could be afraid and still do the math. 2 shooters. Rifle at 11 o'clock, 7 to 8 feet from the entrance. Handgun at 2 o'clock, closer to the interior, which meant he was the more immediate threat to anyone trying to move through the space. Both men were moving erratically, which was not the movement of people executing a planned assault. It was the movement of people reacting to something that had gone wrong. She did not understand yet what that thing was, but she noted it. She turned to the tech standing behind her, frozen. "Fire alarm, pull station right now," she said. Not loud, very level. "Every alarm in this building." He stared at her. "It clears the corridors and it calls the fire department," she said. "Go." He went. She turned back to the entrance. The man with the rifle was shouting something she couldn't fully make out over the screaming. A name, or maybe a demand, she couldn't tell yet. The man with the handgun had moved toward the intake desk and was sweeping it with the weapon, which was terrifying but also told her something. He was looking for someone specific. This was not a robbery. This was not random. She stepped back to the wall and pressed herself against it and pulled her phone. She called the charge desk instead of 911 because 911 would come eventually, and the charge desk needed to move patients now. Deborah answered on the second ring. "Deb," Mara said, "active shooter in the ER entrance, 2 armed individuals, possible third unknown. I need a lockdown on every ward above the first floor. I need all ambulatory patients moved to interior rooms. I need Mrs. Tavares and 6 on a gurney and moved to the cardiac wing right now, not in 5 minutes. There was a pause that lasted less than 2 seconds. "Mara, I know what I'm saying, please." Another pause. "Okay," Deborah said, and hung up. And Mara trusted that she would move because in 11 years of running a floor, Deborah Haas had never been the kind of person who froze. The fire alarm went off. The sound was enormous, the kind of sound that rewrites what a space feels like, that turns a hospital corridor into something abstract and loud and all-directional. The 2 men in the entrance reacted to it the way people react to sudden, overwhelming noise, which was to flinch, to pull back slightly, to lose their fixed orientation for just a moment. In that moment, Marcus got up from behind the reception desk and ran. He ran the wrong way, toward the interior of the building instead of toward the exit. And the man with the handgun tracked him, and Mara was already moving before she understood why, positioning herself at the corner of the corridor at the edge of his sight line, not to intercept but to create another reference point, another presence, something that would split his attention. "Hey," she said. The man with the handgun turned toward her. He was young. She registered that immediately. Not a child, but young, maybe mid-20s, and the whites of his eyes were showing too much above the balaclava, which meant adrenaline and fear in quantities that did not produce good decisions. She raised her hands, empty, visible, palms out. "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's all." He stared at her for 1 second, 2, 3, and in those seconds she was reading everything she could about him, his posture, his breathing, the way he was holding the weapon, which was not the grip of someone trained, which was either better or worse, depending on what happened next. "Where is he?" said. "Who?" "Dario." "Where did they take him?" She did not know who Dario was. She told him so. "I've been on shift since 3 o'clock. Tell me what you're looking for, and I'll tell you what I know." Something shifted in him. Not de-escalation, not yet, but the particular shift that happens when someone who is running purely on adrenaline and mission encounters a person who is not behaving the way the mission anticipated. He had expected screaming. He had expected people to run. He had not expected someone to stand still and ask a clarifying question. Behind her, she could hear the fire alarm, and beneath it, the distant layered sound of sirens. Police, she thought, multiple units, which meant someone had already called it in before the alarm. Probably a patient with a phone. Probably 15 different patients with phones. "My brother," the man with the handgun said. He said it differently than everything else he'd said. Lower, rougher, like the word came from somewhere that didn't have anything to do with the weapon in his hand. "They brought him here. He got shot. I need to know if he's—" "Okay," Mara said, and she kept her voice exactly level. "Okay. If your brother was brought in tonight, I can find out where he is. But I need you to tell me, how long ago did he come in? How bad was it?" The man with the rifle had moved deeper into the entrance behind her, and she was aware of him as a secondary variable she was currently not addressing because she could only work the problem in front of her. 2 hours ago, the man said. Maybe 3. They said, "Somebody said he coded in the ambulance. I need to know if he's alive." "Tell me his name," Mara said. "Dario Vasquez." She filed the name. She would find out. She would tell him. But first, "Your friend behind me," she said quietly. "Is he going to do something that makes it impossible for me to help you?" The young man, the brother, looked past her toward the entrance, and in the slight motion of his jaw she read the answer before he gave it, which was that he didn't fully know, which was the worst possible answer. The sirens outside were very close now. There were at least 3 different sets, and she could hear the specific rhythm of vehicles positioning, which meant tactical response, not just patrol. Someone out there was treating this seriously and correctly, and that was good except that the window she had, this particular window, this man in front of her who had not fired his weapon, and who was looking at her like a person looks at something they weren't expecting to need, was closing. "Listen to me," she said. "I'm going to find out if your brother is alive, right now. But the people outside are going to breach this building in the next few minutes, and I need you to make a decision about what happens when they do." He looked at her. "What decision?" "Whether you're here because of your brother," she said, "or whether you're here for something else. Because those 2 things lead to very different endings." He didn't answer, but his hand dropped slightly. The weapon still in it, but lower, and the quality of his grip had changed. Then from somewhere above them, from the second floor or the roof, she heard something that rewired everything she had been calculating in the last 6 minutes. A single shot. From outside the building, high angle. Then the sound of someone falling. The rifle-armed man at the entrance went down. Not dead, she assessed immediately from the way he moved when he hit the floor, grabbing at his leg, screaming. And the brother spun toward the entrance, and the tactical calculation she had been running collapsed and rebuilt itself in under 2 seconds because there was now a wounded man in the entrance, a panicked man in front of her, and whoever had fired that shot from an elevated position outside, which was either a police sniper or something else entirely, and she did not yet know which. The brother turned back to her. His eyes were wild. "What was that?" "He's down. He's not dead," she said immediately, because she needed him focused. but I have to get to him, or he's going to bleed out on that floor. She didn't wait for permission. She moved toward the entrance, keeping herself low and to the wall, and the young man with the handgun followed her. Not pointing the weapon at her, just following, because she was moving toward something and he didn't know what else to do. The man with the rifle was on the floor of the entrance with a wound to his thigh that was bleeding fast. The kind of fast that had a specific color and volume that told her she had maybe 4 minutes before this became irreversible. She dropped to her knees next to him, and her hands were already doing what hands that have done this before do. Finding the site, applying pressure, reading the injury. And behind her she could hear the sounds of the tactical team at the perimeter making the specific decisions that tactical teams made when their angle of engagement had just changed. She pressed hard on the wound with both hands and did not look up. "Tell me your name," she said to the man on the floor. His eyes were open. "Good. Get away from me," he said through his teeth. "I'll get away from you when you're stable," she said. "Name." He said nothing. "Okay," she said. "You don't have to talk, but I need you to stay awake." She heard a voice from outside, amplified, a bullhorn, the flat and oddly bureaucratic tone of law enforcement in an active situation. "This is the Keswick County Sheriff's Department. All individuals in the building do not move. Medical personnel, identify yourselves." She raised one hand, the one that wasn't keeping this man's blood inside his body, and called toward the shattered entrance in the loudest voice she'd used all night. "Medical personnel in the entrance. Nurse, hands visible. I have a GSW. I need a trauma kit, and I need it right now." There was a pause. Then a voice, different from the bullhorn, closer, someone moving toward the entrance on the outside, said something she couldn't quite catch, and a second voice said something back. And then the first voice said, clearly enough that she heard every word, "Hold, don't fire. I want to know who that is." And then the night went very quiet, except for the fire alarm still screaming overhead and the wet, irregular breathing of the man whose blood was on her hands. And somewhere outside, someone was asking a question about her that she had not been asked in a very long time. The voice outside said it again, quieter the second time, not into the bullhorn, but to someone standing close, someone whose answer apparently mattered enough to make a tactical team hold its position in the middle of an active shooter situation. "Who is that?" Mara didn't hear the answer. She was too focused on the man bleeding under her hands to track the conversation at the perimeter, but she registered the pause that followed. Longer than a tactical pause should be, longer than procedure allowed for, and filed it the way she filed everything that didn't make immediate sense, as information she didn't have enough context for yet. The wound was a through and through to the lateral thigh, which was the best possible version of a gunshot wound to the leg, and still bad enough to kill him if she lost another 2 minutes. The femoral wasn't clipped. She would have known by now. The blood would have told her. But a major branch was involved, and the pressure she was applying with both hands was the only thing currently standing between this man and hemorrhagic shock. "Stay with me," she said. Not gently. She said it the way you say something to a person you need to stay functional, which is direct and with enough weight behind it that they understand the instruction is serious. "Look at the ceiling. Keep your eyes open." He was looking at her instead of the ceiling, which was fine. Looking at her meant he was tracking something. Behind her, she could hear the brother, Dario's brother, she still didn't know his name, breathing hard and fast, the rhythm of someone whose adrenaline was running past the point where the body knows what to do with it. He hadn't moved. He hadn't raised the weapon. She was aware of him the way she was aware of everything in her immediate environment, as a variable with potential. "Put the gun down," she said to him, without turning around. He didn't answer. "Not for them," she said. "For me, because I can't use my hands to help either of these men if I'm also managing the possibility that you're going to do something that makes the people outside react." A beat. Then she heard the sound of a weapon being set on the tile floor, and she exhaled, just slightly, just once, and kept her hands where they were. The bullhorn again. Individuals in the entrance. The medical personnel is instructed to move away from the subject and toward the exterior. "I can't do that," she called back. She didn't shout it. She said it at a volume that carried. "He'll bleed out. I need supplies brought to me, or I need you to let me move him to a treatment room." Another pause. These pauses were doing something, she realized. They were not the pauses of a tactical team waiting for a clear engagement decision. They were the pauses of a tactical team receiving information from somewhere else. Then a different voice. No bull. This time, a person at the entrance itself, close enough to be speaking at a normal volume, said, "Solis." She went very still. Nobody at Harrow Vale called her Solis. She was Mara to everyone on the floor, and occasionally, "Hey you," to the attendings, who hadn't bothered to learn the night shift names. Nobody had called her by her last name, just her last name, since she'd separated from service. She looked up. The man standing at the broken entrance was in tactical gear, vest, radio, helmet pushed back. But he was standing differently than the officers behind him, and she knew the difference between a law enforcement tactical stance and a military one. And this was the second thing. He was maybe 40, compact, with the specific economy of movement that came from spending years somewhere that penalized unnecessary motion. I was looking at her like he already knew her. "Don't," she said, before he could say anything else. He stopped. "Not right now," she said. "Right now I need a trauma kit. Tourniquet, pressure dressing, saline if you have it. This man has a lateral thigh GSW, and I've been holding manual pressure for 4 minutes." He looked at her for one more second, a complicated look, the kind that held too many things to sort through quickly. And then he turned and said something short and quiet to the officer beside him, and 30 seconds later, a kit was sliding across the floor toward her. She caught it with her knee, popped it open without releasing pressure, and started working. She packed the wound properly, applied the tourniquet 2 inches above the site, checked the seal. The man on the floor was pale and sweating, but his eyes were still open and his breathing had stabilized into something that was bad, but not immediately terminal. She told him so. "You're not going to die from this tonight," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a person who had not yet decided whether to believe her. "Okay," he said. It was the first word he'd said to her directly. She sat back on her heels and let the tactical medic, there was one now, she saw, coming through the entrance with another kit, take over. She pulled off the gloves that weren't gloves, just her bare hands she'd been pressing with, and looked at the blood on her palms for a moment in the flat overhead light of the entrance, and then wiped them on her scrubs because there was nothing else to do with them. The man from the entrance crouched down next to her. "You good?" he said. "I'm fine." She looked at him. "How do you know my name?" "I was at Kandahar in 2019, he said. "Third rotation. You were attached to 2nd Group, Southwestern District. You ran the aid station for 6 weeks when the primary went down with appendicitis." She looked at him. "I don't remember you," she said. It wasn't an apology, just a fact. She had not remembered many faces from that period. She had been very busy and very tired, and she had made a deliberate choice when she came home not to spend too much effort reconstructing the specific details. "You wouldn't," he said. "I was a junior officer. You told me to get out of your aid station because I was in the way." Despite everything, the blood on her hands and the alarm still screaming overhead, and the man on the floor, and whatever was happening outside, she felt something that might have been the very distant ancestor of amusement. "That sounds right," she said. "Captain Reed Farrow," he said. "Keswick County SWAT, attached to the Regional Tactical Unit. We had a call about an active shooter, and I was on the incident command team when they ran the description of the medical personnel at the entrance. And someone on my team used to work a different kind of job, and he recognized the description." He paused. "The way you were working, the position you took. He said it looked like someone who'd done this under worse conditions." She said nothing. "Is that accurate?" he said. "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's what I do." He let it sit for a moment. Then he said, "There's a situation I need to brief you on." She stood up. Her knees had the particular ache of someone who had been on a tile floor in a bad position for too long, and she registered it and moved anyway. "Brief me," she said. The situation, as Farrow laid it out in the following 3 minutes, was this. The young man behind her, whose name, it turned out, was Tomas Vasquez, had a brother named Dario, who had been brought into Harrow Vale 2 hours and 40 minutes ago with 3 gunshot wounds sustained during what the police were calling an interrupted armed robbery. Dario Vasquez had coded in the ambulance and had been worked on aggressively on arrival and was currently in the ICU in critical but stable condition, meaning he was alive, meaning the central fact that had sent Tomas and 2 associates into this building tonight was operating on false information. The man she'd just stabilized was one of those associates, surname Reyes, first name unknown, who had taken the police sniper's round to the thigh when he'd moved his weapon toward a fleeing paramedic, and the sniper had made a judgment call. The third associate, the one Tomas had shown up with, the one whose presence here Mara had only partially accounted for, had not come through the entrance. "Where is he?" she said. Pharaoh's expression did something specific and not entirely readable. "We're not certain," he said. "We have him on exterior camera approaching the building from the east side approximately 9 minutes ago. After that, we lose him." "The east side is the service entrance," she said immediately. "It comes up through the basement to the supply corridor on the first floor. It's not staffed at night." Pharaoh was already on his radio before she finished the sentence. She turned and looked at Tomas, who was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and his weapon 6 feet away and his face in his hands. He looked very young. He looked like someone who had come here for one reason and had arrived at a situation that was much larger and more broken than the reason. She walked over and crouched down to his level. "Your brother is alive," she said. He looked up. "Dario Vasquez," she said. "He came in 2 hours and 40 minutes ago. He's in the ICU. He coded, but they brought him back. He's critical, but stable. Alive." He stared at her. "You're sure?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It was what people said when a thing they'd been holding catastrophe shape turned out to be something else. "I'm going to confirm it right now," she said. "But yes, I'm sure." She pulled out her phone. It had survived the last 20 minutes in her pocket, though the screen had a crack she didn't remember it having, and called the charge desk. Deborah answered. "Dario Vasquez, ICU. Status." She heard keyboard keys. "Critical stable," Deborah said. "Post-arrest, intubated, vitals holding. He's alive, Mara." "Thank you," Mara said, and hung up and looked at Tomas. Something went out of him, not all at once, not a collapse, just a slow descent, like a structure releasing pressure from the inside. His shoulders dropped. His hands came up to cover his face again, and this time it was different than before. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She waited. After a moment he said, muffled behind his hands, "We thought he was dead. Somebody called and said he didn't make it." "Someone told you that?" "Anonymous call. To my mother's house." His hands came down. His eyes were red. 4 hours ago. Said Dario died in the ER. We couldn't get a straight answer when we called the hospital. They kept saying they couldn't give information over the phone, and Tomas, he stopped, corrected himself. I lost it." She filed the information about the anonymous call and kept her face neutral. "Okay," she said. "We're going to deal with what happens next. But right now I need you to tell me about your friend, the one who came in the east entrance." Tomas looked at her. "Marco," he said. "His name is Marco." "What does Marco do when things go wrong?" she said. A pause. "He doesn't stop," Tomas said quietly. "That's the problem. He doesn't stop." She was already standing. Pharaoh was 6 feet away, and she didn't have to call him over. "Service corridor, first floor," she said. "He knows the brother is here for a reason. He doesn't know the reason just changed. He might be moving toward the ICU." Pharaoh processed this in about 2 seconds, and then he was on the radio and people were moving, and Mara was moving too, because she knew this building in a way that tactical teams who had arrived 11 minutes ago did not. And the service corridor split 3 ways at the junction near radiology, and only one of those ways actually went to the ICU elevator. And if Marco didn't know that. She heard the shot before she reached the junction. One shot, interior, close. The specific flat concussive quality of a firearm discharged in an enclosed space, different from the exterior shots, different from the entrance. And she knew from the location of the sound that it came from the supply corridor, not the patient floors. She stopped. Pharaoh was right behind her. "Mara." "Supply corridor," she said, "not the ICU." He got turned around at the junction. She could hear radio traffic now. Officers repositioning. Pharaoh's team moving to seal the corridor exits. The supply corridor was a dead end on the east side. There was a loading dock door at the far end that required a key card to open from the interior, and she was the only one standing here who knew that. "Can you seal the junction?" she said to Pharaoh. "Give me 90 seconds. "You have 60, she said. After 60 seconds, he figures out the loading dock door doesn't open, and he comes back through the junction, and you lose containment. Pharaoh keyed his radio and gave the order, and in the brief silence between transmissions, she heard something else from the supply corridor. Not a shot, not a voice, but a sound she hadn't anticipated, and that revised her understanding of the entire situation. Someone was crying. Not Marco. The sound was wrong for a man in tactical motion. This was higher, thinner, the specific quality of someone who was badly hurt and trying not to make noise and failing. She looked at Pharaoh. "Someone's down in that corridor," she said. His jaw tightened. "Mara, I can't let you—" "You have a man in that corridor who is armed and not stopping," she said. "And you have someone down who needs medical attention right now. Your team can't go in blind, but I can go in and make contact, and he's less likely to fire at me than at your people." She paused. "You know what my background is. Make a decision." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see the specific tension of a man who knew she was right and didn't want to agree to it. "I need a vest," she said. He unclipped his secondary and handed it to her without a word. She put it on over her scrubs. It was too big and sat wrong across her shoulders and would not stop a direct shot at center mass, but it was better than nothing, and she had operated in worse configurations. She went into the corridor. The supply corridor was long and fluorescent and smelled like cardboard and industrial cleaner. Storage shelves ran down both sides, stacked with IV bags and linens, and the particular infrastructure of a hospital that never appears in the patient-facing areas. The lights here were the older kind, slightly yellow, and they hummed. 20 feet in, she found the person who was crying. It was a young woman. She looked maybe 19, 20, in street clothes, crouched behind a shelving unit with her left arm pressed against her side. Not a hospital employee. Not a patient. She was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, and her sneakers were wet. And she was looking at Mara with the wide, fixed gaze of someone who had moved past the point of deciding whether to trust a stranger. "Hey," Mara said quietly. She crouched down. "I'm a nurse. Let me see." The girl moved her arm away, and Mara looked, and the injury was a graze. The bullet had caught the lateral edge of her torso and torn a furrow through skin and subcutaneous tissue, but hadn't penetrated the cavity. It was bleeding significantly, and it was going to hurt for a long time, and it needed proper attention, but it was not immediately life-threatening. "You're okay," Mara said. "It looks worse than it is. Can you tell me who you came in with?" The girl shook her head. "Did you come in with Marco?" Mara said. The girl's eyes moved, just fractionally, just the micro-expression of someone who has decided not to answer, but whose face has already answered. And Mara took that as confirmation. "Where is he now?" she said. Before the girl could respond, she heard footsteps at the far end of the corridor, heavy, moving fast toward the loading dock door, which meant Marco had realized the route was blocked, and was, no, not fast enough. He wasn't moving toward the door, he was moving away from it. He'd already tried the door, he was coming back. She stood up and turned to face the end of the corridor. Marco was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and he was moving with the kind of body language that was not tactical and not panicked, but something in between. The movement of someone who had committed to something and had not yet built the mechanism to uncommit. He had a handgun in his right hand, held low, and when he saw her, he slowed but didn't stop. "I need to get out," he said. "I know," she said. She kept her hands visible, kept her voice flat and informational. "The loading dock requires a key card. The only exit from this corridor that's not currently sealed is behind me." He looked at her. He looked at the vest she was wearing, which was visibly not hers, and then he looked at her face. "You're the nurse," he said, "from the front." "I'm a nurse," she said, "and I'm telling you the layout of this building because I think you should know what you're actually dealing with before you make any more decisions." He said nothing. "There are 7 officers at the junction behind me," she said, which was not precisely true but was close enough. "Your route is gone. The only way out of this corridor for you is through me, and I'm not moving, and after me there are 7 officers." She paused. "Or you can put the weapon down and I'll walk you out of here myself." He laughed at that. Short, humorless, the laugh of a man who finds the offer absurd. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Because the man you came here for, Dario Vasquez, is alive," she said. "He's in the ICU. He's breathing. Whatever you thought you were here to do tonight is based on information that was wrong, and it would be a significant waste of everyone involved if you made this worse than it already is." He stopped moving entirely. The corridor was very quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint sound of the girl behind her, breathing carefully, pressing her arm against her side. "Dario's alive," he said. Not a question, testing the shape of it. "Alive," she said. "Critical but stable. He has a long recovery ahead of him. He's going to need people in his life to not be in federal custody for the next several years." Marco's gun hand dropped another inch, and then, from somewhere she had not accounted for, not from the junction, not from behind her, but from above, from the utility access in the ceiling of the supply corridor that she had completely forgotten existed and that apparently a third party had not, came the sound of metal shifting against metal, and a ceiling panel moved, and a flashlight beam cut down into the corridor. A voice said, "Federal agents. Nobody move." She had not called the FBI. Farrow had not mentioned the FBI. The FBI did not respond to active shooter calls in under 20 minutes, which meant they had already been here. Which meant something about tonight was not what she had thought it was. And the anonymous call to Tomas's mother, and the 3 armed men who had come to a hospital because they believed a brother was dead, and the specific precision with which this situation had escalated, all of it rearranged itself in her mind into a shape that was colder and more deliberate than she had been calculating for. She stood in the middle of the supply corridor with a federal flashlight beam cutting down from the ceiling, and Marco's gun still in his hand and the girl behind her bleeding quietly against the shelving, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent years reading the difference between the situation on the surface and the situation underneath it, that what had happened tonight was not an accident. Someone had sent those men here. And the question she needed to answer, the question that was going to determine what the next 12 hours looked like, was who had made that call to Tomas's mother, and why they had wanted those 3 men inside this building tonight, and what it was they had been trying to make happen. The federal agent came down from the ceiling the way people do when they've been up there longer than anyone expected, stiffly, with the particular controlled movement of someone whose joints had been folded wrong for an extended period, catching the lip of the shelving unit to take his weight before his boots hit the floor. He was in plain clothes under a tactical vest, which told her he hadn't responded from a field office. He'd been here, in the building, before the shooting started. There were 2 of them. The second dropped down 30 seconds after the first, smaller, moving faster, and she caught the edge of a badge on a lanyard before they both oriented on Marco with weapons drawn, and she had about 3 seconds before this became a problem. "He's compliant," she said immediately. "Weapon is in his hand, but he hasn't raised it in the last 90 seconds. If you come in hard right now, he's going to react." The first agent, tall, late 30s, with the expression of someone who had been managing controlled situations for long enough that an unexpected variable genuinely annoyed him, looked at her. "Ma'am," step back from the subject. "I'm a nurse, and I'm the only reason this corridor hasn't become a shooting scene," she said. "I need you to hold your approach for 15 seconds while I finish this conversation." He looked at Marco. Marco looked at him. The gun was still in Marco's hand, still low, still not raised, but the room had shifted, the quality of it had changed, and she could feel the calibration point moving. "Marco," she said, without turning away from the agents. She kept her voice the same way she'd kept it the entire time. Flat, direct, carrying only information. 3 things are true right now. Dario is alive. The exit you need is behind me. And the men with weapons in front of you are federal agents who were already in this building before you arrived. She let that last part sit for exactly 1 beat. "Think about what that means," she said. She watched his face do the math. It wasn't fast. It was the slow recalculation of a man who had come here believing one set of facts and was standing in the ruins of them now, trying to figure out which pieces still mattered. His grip on the weapon changed, not releasing. But the quality of it changed, the intention behind it changed, and she recognized that shift the way she recognized changes in a patient's breathing, as a sign that the body was making a decision before the mind had caught up. He set the gun on the floor. He didn't crouch down to do it carefully. He just opened his hand and let it drop, and the clatter of it on the tile was very loud in the corridor. And then he put both hands behind his head without being told to, because he had been in situations before where that was the correct next action, and he still had enough operational presence to know it. The agents moved forward. Mara stepped aside, turned back to the girl, and got to work. The Gray's wound had bled more in the last 4 minutes than she'd wanted. She stripped a pressure dressing from the kit still strapped to her hip, Farrow's kit, which she'd taken without asking when she came into the corridor, and applied it with the efficiency of someone who had done field dressing under conditions that made a hospital supply corridor feel like an operating theater. The girl hissed and grabbed the shelving unit with her free hand. "I know," Mara said. "Hold still." "Is it bad?" "It's not good, but you'll keep the ribs." She secured the dressing, checked the seal, pressed 2 fingers against the girl's wrist and counted. Pulse was fast but strong. Shock was a risk, but not an immediate one. "What's your name?" "Lena," the girl said. "How old are you, Lena?" A pause. 20. "Did you know what tonight was going to be?" Another pause, longer. "No, Marco said he just needed a ride." Mara sat with that for a moment and didn't comment on it because there was nothing useful to say, and there would be time later for Lena to sit with the specific weight of believing someone who told you to just be there. She got Lena to her feet carefully, took her weight on one side, and started walking her toward the junction. Pharaoh met them at the corridor entrance. He looked at the dressing, looked at Lena, looked at Mara. "The federal agent's in there," Mara said quietly, while Lena was being transferred to a paramedic who had materialized from somewhere behind Pharaoh. How long were they in the building before the shooting started? His jaw did the thing it had done before, the tightening that meant he had information he was deciding whether to share. "Read," she said. "I don't know the full picture," he said. "What I know is that when the call came in, my incident commander already had a file open on the Vasquez situation, pre-existing federal interest. That's all I was told." "That's not all," she said. He met her eyes. "That's all I'm going to say in this corridor." She accepted that for now. She filed it with everything else she was filing. The ER entrance had been cleared by the time she walked back through it. Reyes, the man she'd packed and tourniqueted, had been loaded for transport to a trauma center that had a surgical team better equipped for the vascular work he needed. Tomas was in zip cuffs, sitting against the wall outside with 2 officers, and when he saw her, he tracked her with his eyes but didn't say anything. She nodded at him once. Not absolution, not comfort, just acknowledgement. And he looked away. The first thing she did when she got back to the floor was go to room 6. Mrs. Tavares was not in room 6. She found Deborah at the charge desk and got the answer in about 4 seconds. Tavares had been moved to the cardiac floor at 11:52. Vitals had deteriorated further around midnight. She was currently in a monitored bed with the cardiology attending, who had been called in from home. "How is she?" Mara said. Deborah looked at her, at the blood on her scrubs, the borrowed vest still across her shoulders, the crack in her phone screen, and the particular quality of her face, which was, she knew, not an easy face to read, but which Deborah had been reading for 2 years. "They think they caught it in time," Deborah said carefully. "Dr. Okafor is with her." Mara nodded. "And Prescott?" she said. "Paperwork," Deborah said, which was not really an answer, but was answer enough. She went to the break room, took off the vest, and stood at the sink for a full 90 seconds washing her hands. The soap was the industrial kind that smelled like nothing and dried out her knuckles, and she used more of it than she needed because the sensation of the water and the motion was something her nervous system required right now. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all night. They would continue to be steady because that was what she'd trained them to do, and the training did not switch off just because the crisis was over. But the steadiness was not the same as being fine, and she was aware of the difference even if nobody else in the building was. She was sitting in the break room with a cup of the terrible coffee when Dr. Prescott came in. He looked at her differently than he usually did. It was a small difference, not dramatic, not a complete reversal, but it was there, in the way he stopped when he saw her, and didn't immediately move toward the coffee maker with the assumption that she was simply occupying space. "Deborah told me what you did out there," he said. She didn't answer. "The triage. Keeping that man alive until the paramedics could transport. And the man in the corridor," he paused. "She said you went in there alone." "Not alone," she said. "There was backup at the junction." "Mara, Mrs. Tavares needed to be escalated 3 hours before she said. Not loudly. She wasn't angry, exactly. Anger required energy she was currently allocating to other things. "I flagged her twice, and I made the notes. If Dr. Okafor finds what I think he's going to find, she was running out of time before midnight." Prescott was quiet for a moment. "I hear you," he said. It was not an apology. She hadn't expected one. But it was more than he'd given her at 11 o'clock, and she registered it and moved on. The FBI agents found her 20 minutes later. There were two of them, the ones from the ceiling, whose names were, respectively, Special Agent Dana Voss and Special Agent Marcus Pruitt, and who presented their credentials with the particular practiced smoothness of people who spent most of their professional time presenting credentials to people who were not expecting them. Voss was the one who'd spoken in the corridor. Pruitt was the smaller one who moved faster. They wanted a conference room. She told them the only conference room on this floor was currently being used as a secondary triage space. They used the break room. Voss put a folder on the table that she didn't open. "I want to be direct with you," Voss said, which in Mara's experience was what people said immediately before they were not entirely direct with you. "The Vasquez situation is part of a larger investigation that's been running for about 14 months. Dario Vasquez is not just a victim of a robbery gone wrong. He's a material witness in a federal case." Mara looked at her. "Okay." "Someone made a call to the Vasquez family tonight. That call was made from a burner phone that we've traced to a cell tower 3 blocks from this hospital." Voss paused. "Someone wanted Tomas Vasquez and his associates in this building tonight." "I know," Mara said. Voss and Pruitt exchanged a look. "You know," Pruitt said. "I worked it out in the supply corridor," she said. "The timing was too specific. The anonymous call was placed after Dario was already stable. Whoever made it knew he was stable and told the family he was dead anyway. The goal wasn't to help the family get information. The goal was to get armed people into this building." She paused. "Which means either someone wanted Dario Vasquez hurt in a location that would obscure the intent, or someone wanted the people who came here to protect him taken out of the picture." A silence. Voss opened the folder. She turned it around and pushed it across the table. Inside was a photograph. A man, mid-40s, in a suit, outside what looked like a courthouse. Mara didn't recognize him. "His name is Garrett Ulrich," Voss said. "He's a senior administrator at the Keswick County Medical Licensing Board." Mara looked at the photograph. "He's been under investigation for 14 months for medical fraud, corruption, and conspiracy," Voss continued. "We believe he's responsible for falsifying records that led to the deaths of at least 3 patients in this county over the last 2 years." The shape of it was forming in Mara's mind. Not all of it. There were still pieces she didn't have, but enough of it that she was beginning to see the architecture. "Dario Vasquez saw something," she said. "Dario Vasquez was a maintenance contractor in the building where Ulrich has his secondary office," Voss said. 6 weeks ago, he witnessed a meeting he wasn't supposed to witness, and he came to us 3 days later. He was 2 weeks away from formal testimony. And tonight, we believe Ulrich made the call," Voss said. "We can't prove it yet. The burner traces to a purchase made through a third party. But the timing, the method, the choice of this hospital specifically..." She stopped. "Dario was brought here after the shooting because Harrow Vale is the closest level 2 trauma center. Ulrich knew that. If Tomas and his associates had gotten to the ICU, Dario would be dead," Mara said. "And it would look like a family dispute, or collateral in a hospital shooting." "Yes." She sat with that. It was one of those moments where a night that had been terrible in a specific and manageable way revealed itself to be terrible in a much larger and more deliberate way, and the recalibration required was not comfortable. "What do you need from me?" she said. Voss looked at her steadily. "Right now, nothing. We're telling you this because you have a right to understand what happened in this building tonight, and because Captain Farrow told me who you are." "Farrow doesn't know who I am," she said, without particular heat. "He knows enough," Voss said. "He said, and I'm quoting here, that you ran a combat aid station in a forward operating area for 6 weeks without losing a patient, under conditions that would have shut down most civilian ERs, and that you did it while also somehow keeping 3 junior officers from making decisions that would have gotten people killed." Mara said nothing. "Is that accurate?" Voss said. "The part about the junior officers is exaggerated," she said. "There were 2, and one of them mostly listened." Something in Voss's expression shifted, not quite amusement, but in that direction, and quickly gone. "We may need a formal statement in the coming days," Voss said, "about what you observed tonight, what was said to you, what you saw in terms of the individual's behavior and intentions." "That's fine," Mara said. "And there's one more thing." She waited. Voss reached into the folder again and produced a second photograph, smaller than the first. printed on plain paper rather than the higher quality stock of the first image. She placed it on the table and slid it across. It was a surveillance still. Interior of the hospital, she recognized the corridor, the particular angle of the lighting, taken from the camera above the entrance to the first-floor service area. Timestamp read 23:58, 2 minutes before midnight. In the frame, a person in a hospital coat, back to the camera, standing at the service entrance keypad, not entering, standing, and beside the keypad, a small rectangular object that Mara recognized after a moment as a signal relay, the kind used to clone an access card signal without the physical card. "That's how he got this door open," Mara said. "Not Marco. The coat was wrong. The build was wrong. That's someone else. Someone who was already in the building," Pruitt said. "Someone who works here. Someone who let Marco Reyes in through the service entrance and then disappeared before the tactical team arrived." She looked at the image again. The coat, the angle, the deliberate positioning away from the camera. "You don't know who it is," she said. "We have 3 candidates based on shift schedules and access records," Voss said. "We're working through them." "Show me the access records," Mara said. Voss hesitated. "Ms. Solis, you're not a federal—" "I've been on this floor since 3 in the afternoon," Mara said. "I know who was here tonight. Show me the records and I can cut your candidate list." Another exchange of looks between the agents. Pruitt opened his tablet and turned it toward her. She read the access log for the first-floor service entrance for the previous 6 hours. 3 entries. 2 were standard, a supply delivery signed in at 7 p.m., a maintenance call at 9:15 that had been logged in advance. The third was at 11:51, 9 minutes before Marco appeared on the exterior camera. The credential used for the 11:51 entry belonged to the attending physician on overnight rotation. She looked at the name. Then she looked at it again, because the first time she looked at it, she did not fully process it, and she needed to look at it twice to confirm she was reading it correctly. Dr. Nolan Prescott. The silence in the break room had a different quality now. She became aware, in a specific and detached way, that Voss was watching her face, and that Pruitt had his hand near his radio, and that the door to the break room was closed, and that Nolan Prescott was 40 feet away doing paperwork at the nurse's station. "I was in the building all night," she said. Her voice was very level. "He was here when the shooting started. He sent me to the waiting room at 11:15, which put me away from the entrance, away from the floor, and away from Mrs. Tavares." She stopped. The geometry of the evening was rearranging itself with a specificity that was not comfortable. He didn't escalate Tavares. He didn't escalate her because moving her to the cardiac floor would have put him in contact with the cardiology team and reduced his freedom of movement on this floor. "Mara," Voss started. "He delayed her care," she said. "Deliberately, or at least conveniently." She stopped herself. "That's conjecture. What's not conjecture is that his credential was used at 11:51 to open the service door." "We know," Voss said quietly. "Then why is he still at the nurse's station?" "Because we can't move on him yet," Pruitt said. "If we pull him now, Ulrich's lawyers will have him out in 6 hours, and we lose the chain of evidence. We need Dario Vasquez's testimony, and we need Prescott's connection to Ulrich fully documented before we make the arrest. If we move tonight, we lose the case." She understood the logic. She understood it completely, and she also found it almost unbearable, in the specific way that knowing the correct answer and being required to sit with it was almost unbearable. "How long?" she said. 48 hours, Voss said. "Maybe less." She looked at the access log on Pruitt's tablet for one more moment, and then she looked up. "Mrs. Tavares," she said. "Is she going to be all right?" Voss's expression was careful. "We don't know yet." Mara stood up. She took the borrowed vest from the chair where she'd left it. She moved to the door. "I'm going back on the floor," she said. "Ms. Solis, he doesn't know what I know," she said, without turning around. "And you need 48 hours. So I'm going back on the floor." She paused. "But I want your number. And I want you to have someone watching the ICU." She went back out into the corridor without waiting for a response. The floor was quieter now. The alarms had been silenced, the patients who could be moved had been moved, and the particular thick-aired quality of a building that has experienced something extreme and is now trying to normalize was present in the way people moved, the way they spaces between words. A police officer was at the entrance taking a statement from a tech who had been in the waiting room. Two nurses she knew were standing near the elevator, talking in low voices, and they looked at her when she passed with the particular expression of people who have just learned something about someone they thought they knew. She didn't stop. She went to the charge desk, picked up the next chart in the queue, and started reading it. Prescott was 3 feet away. He looked up from his paperwork when she sat down, and she read his face the way she'd been reading faces all night, quickly, for what was underneath the surface presentation. And what she read there was not guilt exactly, not the hot expressive guilt of someone caught, but something cooler and more organized, the composure of someone who was managing his internal state with deliberate effort. He didn't know. He didn't know what she knew, or what was on Pruitt's tablet, or what the credential log said at 11:51. "You should go home," he said. "Shift's effectively over. The relief team is coming in." "I'll finish the queue," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You did good work tonight," he said. The words were genuine in their surface construction. She could tell he meant them, in the specific and limited way that people mean things when they say them. And they were also the words of a man who had no idea that the person he was saying them to had been sitting in the break room 20 minutes ago looking at his name on a federal access log. She looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said, and she went back to the chart. She was halfway through the third chart in the queue when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved, which she knew was Voss because only 2 people in the world had texted her in the last 6 hours, and one of them was Deborah asking about a medication query at 11 p.m. The text said, "ICU, Dario Vasquez's room. Now, if you can." She set the chart down carefully, told Deborah she needed 10 minutes, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The ICU at 1:30 in the morning had the quality of all ICUs at night, muted, dim, with the rhythmic infrastructure of machines doing the work of bodies that could not fully do it themselves. She found Voss outside the room at the end of the corridor, and the look on Voss's face when she approached told her something was wrong before a word was spoken. "He's stable," Voss said immediately. "Vitals are holding." "But?" Voss nodded toward the room's interior window. She looked. Dario Vasquez was in the bed, intubated, sedated, with the equipment she expected around him. That was all correct. What was not correct was the cardiac monitor reading, which through the window she could see had shifted from what Deborah had described an hour ago, stable sinus rhythm, to a pattern she recognized immediately as the distinct and dangerous signature of an arrhythmia that did not develop on its own in a 30-year-old man with otherwise healthy cardiac history. It was the specific pattern that developed when someone had been given something they shouldn't have. "Who's been in this room in the last 40 minutes?" she said. "ICU nurse. Shh. Verified. She's been at the desk. Respiratory therapist at 1 a.m. Standard visit." Voss paused. "And a physician who came up to review the case file. Signed in at 1:14. She already knew. "You need to get a toxicology panel running right now," she said. "Full panel, priority, and you need to tell the ICU attending what you're looking for." She was already moving toward the room. "And you need to make that call about your 48 hours. Mara, he's been dosed with something," she said. "I don't know what yet, but that arrhythmia doesn't appear on its own. He's stable right now, but the window is closing." She stopped at the room door and looked back at Voss. "You wanted 48 hours. You have about 45 minutes. She pushed open the door and went to her patient. The monitor showed her exactly what she'd seen from the window, and up close it was worse. The intervals were lengthening in the specific way that preceded the kind of event that did not reverse itself without intervention, and the ICU nurse who was now behind her in the doorway made a sound that was not quite a gasp, but was in that direction. Mara turned to her. "I need the attending in here right now," she said, "and I need you to pull his last 15 minutes of readings and compare them to admission baseline." She paused. "And I need you to not touch anything in this room that isn't attached to him until someone from the federal team has cleared it." The nurse stood for 1 second, the specific second in which people decide whether to defer to the person in front of them or wait for official authorization. And then she turned and moved fast toward the desk. Mara stood at Dario Vasquez's bedside and watched the monitor and thought about a man signing a credential log at 11:51 and signing into an ICU at 1:14, and about the specific logistics of what that required, and about what kind of person did those things, and then sat at a nurse's station complimenting the people around him on their work. The attending arrived at a run, pulling on a coat, and she stepped back and briefed him in 30 seconds. Flat, clinical, the specific compressed language of someone who had given urgent handoffs before. And he listened without interrupting, which she recognized as the response of a doctor who was hearing something he believed. He ordered the panel. He called pharmacy. He looked at the monitor and said something under his breath that she didn't catch. She stepped back into the corridor. Voss was on the phone. Pruitt was beside her, and he caught Mara's eye and gave a single small nod, which she took to mean the machine was moving now, that the calculation had changed, that 48 hours was no longer the operational window. She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling. Somewhere in this building, Dr. Nolan Prescott was sitting at a nurse's station doing paperwork. He had complimented her on her work. He had told her to go home. He had spent 14 months, or some portion of it, helping a man orchestrate the deaths of at least 3 patients. And tonight he had opened a door and sent her away from an entrance and delayed the care of a woman with a failing heart. And now he had walked into an ICU and done something to the one man who could put Garrett Ulrich in a federal courtroom. She became aware, standing in the ICU corridor, that her hands were not steady anymore, not shaking, not visibly. But the steadiness was effortful now in a way it hadn't been an hour ago, and she recognized it as the specific thing that happened when the body had been running on controlled urgency for long enough that the control itself started to cost something. She pressed the back of her head against the wall and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was not rest, but it was the acknowledgement that a body was being used, and she had learned that acknowledgement was sometimes enough to keep things functioning. She opened her eyes. Voss had come off the phone. "We're moving on Prescott," she said. Her voice was different, not colder exactly, but compressed, stripped of anything that wasn't information. 2 minutes. "Okay," Mara said. "I need you to not be near the nurse's station when we do," Voss said. "I need him not to associate you with what's happening." "Why?" she said. Voss looked at her steadily. "Because we may need you to testify to what you observed tonight. The access log is evidence, but your testimony about Tavares, about what you flagged and when, what he did and didn't do, is part of the pattern. I need him not to have a reason to look at your behavior tonight as adversarial. Not yet." She understood. She didn't like it, which was not the same as not understanding it. "Where do you want me?" she said. "Exactly where you were when this started," Voss said. "At your desk, doing your job." She took the elevator back down to the first floor. She sat at the nurse's station. She picked up the chart she'd left. She started reading. Prescott was 2 chairs down. He had moved on from the paperwork and was reviewing something on the computer, and the light from the screen was on his face, and he looked from 2 chairs away, exactly like a doctor at the end of a long night doing the ordinary work of his profession. She turned the page of the chart and read the next section. She was reading the medication history when she heard the elevator open, and she heard the footsteps. More than 2 people, moving with the specific weight distribution of people who were not coming up to ask a question. And she heard Prescott's chair shift as he registered the same thing. She did not look up. She turned another page. She heard Voss's voice saying his name. She heard the specific quality of silence that preceded someone understanding what was happening. She heard Prescott say, "I don't know what," and then stop, because there was nothing productive in that sentence. And somewhere in the calculus of a man who had spent months managing information, he had learned when to cut the sentence short. She kept reading. She was on the 3rd page of the medication history when she heard him being walked past the nurse's station toward the elevator, and she did not look up for that either, because Voss had told her not to look adversarial, and because she had learned a long time ago that watching someone face consequences was not the same as justice, and she could wait for the thing that was actually justice. But she was aware in the particular peripheral way that you are aware of things you are deliberately not looking at, that as he passed her, Prescott turned his head toward her. She did not know if he was looking for reassurance or for something to read, or if he was looking at her because she was the last familiar face in the room, or if he had somehow, in these last 2 minutes, worked out what she had told the people who were walking him to the elevator. She turned the page. The elevator opened. The elevator closed. The nurse's station was very quiet. Deborah materialized from somewhere and stood next to her and looked at the elevator doors and then looked at Mara and said, "Do I want to know?" "Not yet," Mara said. "Ask me in 48 hours." She put the chart down and rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand, which was something she almost never did. a crack in the composure, small and brief. And then she picked up the next chart. From the third floor, her phone buzzed. She looked at the text from Voss's number. 4 words. Talk screen flagged digoxin. She set the phone down. Digoxin, a cardiac medication, in high doses capable of inducing exactly the arrhythmia she'd read on that monitor. Available in every hospital pharmacy in the country, administered in quantities that, to a sedated ICU patient, would read on initial assessment as a complication rather than a cause. Dario Vasquez would have been dead by morning, and the cause would have read as cardiac event secondary to traumatic injury, and Garrett Ulrich would have had no witness, and whatever Prescott had been promised for his part in it would have been paid, and nobody would have looked twice at the night nurse who had flagged Tavares 3 times before anyone listened. So became aware that her hands were on the surface of the nurse's station desk, palms flat, pressing down slightly. Not visible, just a private pressure, something to push against. She thought about Tomas Vasquez sitting on the floor of the ER entrance with his hands over his face. She thought about Lena bleeding against a shelving unit in a supply corridor because someone had told her she was just a ride. She thought about Bernard Fike sitting in a waiting room for 3 hours because someone had sent Mara to manage intake instead of watching a woman's cardiac decline. She thought about Mrs. Tavares upstairs, in a monitored bed, fighting something she should have been fighting 4 hours earlier. She thought about the specific arithmetic of a man who had sat 2 chairs away from her for 2 years and asked her to do intake while he managed the board. The night shift was ending. Through the windows at the end of the corridor, the sky was beginning to do the thing it did in the hour before dawn. Not lightening yet, but changing quality. The darkness becoming less total, more textured. The particular shift that happened when night was still present, but no longer complete. Her replacement was due at 6. She had 2 more hours. She picked up the chart. She was on the first page when the elevator opened again, and this time the footsteps were different. Quick, light, coming toward her fast. And she looked up because she'd learned tonight to look up when something felt different. The ICU nurse she'd spoken to upstairs was coming across the floor at something close to a run, and her face had the expression that Mara had seen on the faces of people who had information that had just become urgent. "He's crashing," the nurse said, and Mara was on her feet before the sentence finished. She was running before she registered making the decision to run. The elevator took 12 seconds, and she spent 11 of them doing the math. Digoxin toxicity in a sedated post-arrest patient, approximate dose based on the speed of onset, what the monitor had shown her 15 minutes ago, and what it would be showing now, what the attending would have already ordered, and what he would need that he might not have thought of yet. The 12th second was the elevator opening, and she was through the doors before they fully parted. The ICU was not quiet anymore. There were 4 people in the room when she got to the window, and a 5th coming in behind her. The attending, Dr. Okafor, was at the bedside calling orders in the compressed flat voice of someone who was managing the situation and knew it was close. The monitor was showing ventricular fibrillation. The crash cart was already positioned. Someone was doing compressions. She pushed through the door. "What do you have?" she said to Okafor. He looked at her. One of those brief looks that registered her presence and assessed her usefulness in under a second, the specific economy of someone who had no time for anything except the problem in front of him. V-fib, onset approximately 6 minutes ago. We pushed atropine, no response, about to shock. Digoxin toxicity, she said. The tox screen flagged it. Atropine's not going to be enough. You need digoxin-specific antibody fragments before the next shock. Do you have Digibind in pharmacy? We have it. Call it now, she said. Before you shock. If you cardiovert without binding the digoxin, you may convert to a rhythm that won't hold. Okafor looked at her for 1 full second. It was the look of a physician receiving clinical information from a nurse, and she had been on the receiving end of what that look sometimes turned into, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and did not add anything else because she had said what she needed to say, and the rest was his call. He called pharmacy. He called it before the next breath, and she recognized that as the decision of a man who knew how to receive information and act on it without needing to first resolve the question of where it came from. She stepped back and stayed in the room because Okafor hadn't told her to leave, and she wasn't going to leave on her own. The Digibind arrived in 4 minutes. They were long minutes. The compressions continued. The monitor showed a rhythm that was not compatible with life. and the room had the particular quality of controlled emergency. No panic, no wasted motion, just the specific forward-moving mechanics of people who had trained for this and were now doing it, and doing it without the luxury of knowing whether it would work until it either did or didn't. The first dose went in. She watched the monitor, 60 seconds. The rhythm changed. Not immediately, not dramatically. It was not the clean, sudden conversion of a textbook case, because bodies were not textbooks, and digoxin toxicity did not resolve on a schedule. But the character of the irregularity shifted. The compressions paused on Okafor's call. The monitor showed a wavering, uncertain sinus rhythm, imperfect, intermittent, the specific fragility of something that had been pushed to the edge and was now trying to find its way back. "Hold," Okafor said. The room held. The rhythm stabilized. Not normal, not safe, but beating, and beating on its own, and that was the difference between the next action being a second dose and the next action being a notation on a death certificate. She let out the breath she had been managing for the last 4 minutes in the particular careful way that you managed breath when you needed your hands and your mind to be doing other things. Okafor looked across the bed at her. "Good call," he said. It was 2 words. It was not an apology for anything that had happened before tonight, and it did not undo 6 hours of being sent to the waiting room and being talked over and having her flags treated as noise. But it was a physician who had just watched her assessment prove correct in real time, and he had said it in a room with 4 other people, and she registered it and moved on. She stepped back into the corridor. Voss was there. She had appeared at some point during the last 4 minutes, Mara hadn't tracked when, and she was standing with Pruitt and another agent Mara hadn't seen before, and they were all looking at her with the specific expression of people who had been watching through the window. "He's stable," Mara said. "For now, he needs monitoring every 15 minutes, and I want someone in that room who isn't just looking at the chart. Someone who's looking at him." "We have an agent in the room," Voss said. "I mean medical," Mara said. "Someone medical." "I'll talk to Okafor," Voss said. Mara nodded. She leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling and then looked back at Voss. "Where's Prescott right now?" "County holding, pending arraignment," Voss said. He lawyered up immediately, said nothing. "What about Ulrich?" Voss's expression did something specific. "Still at his home address as of 40 minutes ago. We have surveillance on him, but we can't move without the full chain. Prescott's arrest is already going to get back to him. That's unavoidable." "So he knows the timeline has changed," Mara said. "Yes. And Dario Vasquez is the only piece of the chain that connects Ulrich to what Prescott did tonight." "And to the 3 prior patients," Voss said. "Yes." She looked at the door to Dario's room. "Then we need him to wake up," she said, "and we need him to do it before Ulrich has time to build a story." "We're aware," Voss said, and there was something in how she said it that was not dismissive, not the reflexive curtness of someone reminding a civilian where the boundary was, but something more like the response of someone who was running out of options and didn't have the luxury of pretending otherwise. The next 6 hours had a different quality than the first 6. The acute urgency was gone, not the stakes, not the pressure, but the specific forward momentum of a crisis in motion. What replaced it was the harder, slower work of aftermath, the formal statements, the documentation, the particular exhaustion of being asked to reconstruct a sequence of events in clinical detail while your body was still processing the chemical reality of having been awake for more than 20 hours. She gave her statement to a federal recorder in the conference room that had been cleared of its triage function. She was precise. She was specific. She gave times and observations and clinical details, and she did not editorialize, and she did not qualify things she was certain of. When she was uncertain, she said so. When she was asked about Prescott, she described what she had observed, and she did not describe what she felt about it, because feelings were not evidence, and she understood the difference. The recorder, a young agent named Calloway, who took notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to write fast and ask questions later, looked up at one point mid-statement and said, "How do you remember all this with this level of specificity?" She looked at him. "I trained in environments where not remembering things with specificity got people killed." He looked back at his notes. "Right," he said, and kept writing. Deborah brought her coffee at some point, real coffee, from somewhere that wasn't the break room, in a paper cup that said the name of a cafe 3 blocks from the hospital, which meant Deborah had sent someone, or gone herself, or made some other logistical accommodation for the specific fact that Mara was sitting in a conference room giving a federal statement at 4 in the morning and needed something better than the breakroom machine. She didn't say anything about it. She just put it on the table beside her and left. Mara drank half of it and kept talking. The statement took 90 minutes. When she came out, the floor had the early morning quality of a place that had been through something and was doing the maintenance work of continuing to function anyway. The relief shift had technically started. Several of the night staff were still there, either because they hadn't been released yet or because they were the kind of people who stayed when something had happened, which was a particular type of person she recognized and had a certain amount of respect for, even when it was not rational. She went back to the nurse's station because there was nowhere else to be that made more sense. The chart queue had been handled. Deborah had redistributed it, she saw, with the competence of someone who had been quietly managing the logistics of a disrupted floor all night while Mara was occupied with other things. She thought about that. She thought about the specific quality of competence that didn't require acknowledgement to function, and whether she'd ever said that to Deborah directly, and concluded she probably hadn't, and filed it as something to correct. At 5:40 a.m., Voss came back to the floor. She sat down across from Mara at the nurse's station without asking if the chair was available, which was the most direct she'd been since the supply corridor. Ulrich made a move, she said. Mara waited. 47 minutes ago, he contacted his attorney, which we expected. 13 minutes ago, he contacted a secondary number that we've been running down. It traces to a licensing board administrator who has access to hospital accreditation records. Voss placed her phone on the desk between them with a call log on the screen. We believe he's trying to access Dario Vasquez's patient records, to modify them. He can't do that from outside the system, Mara said. No, but someone inside the system can do it for him. Voss looked at her steadily. We've identified a second person on the hospital staff who has had contact with Prescott outside of normal professional channels. Someone in the medical records department. Mara looked at her. We need the records locked, Voss said. Full access freeze on Vasquez's file and on the 3 prior patient files that are connected to this case. Your IT department can do it on the clinical side, but it needs to be ordered by someone with medical authority on this floor, not by us, because a federal hold triggers a notification process that Ulrich will see. Who has that authority right now? The overnight attending, Voss said. Okafor was still on the floor. She found him writing notes outside the room of one of the patients the relief shift hadn't formally taken over yet, and she explained the situation in 90 seconds. He listened the same way he'd listened in the ICU, without interrupting, with the quality of someone assessing information in real time rather than waiting for a gap to speak. Records freeze, he said. On what authority am I doing this? Patient safety and data integrity, she said. Clinical concern for accuracy of records for a patient currently in active critical care. It's within your scope and it doesn't require a federal flag. He looked at her for a moment. You've thought about this more than I have, he said. I've been awake longer, she said. He went to the terminal and made the call to IT security himself, speaking with the specificity of a physician who understood that the phrasing mattered, and the freeze was confirmed at 5:58 a.m. Mara went back to the nurse's station and texted Voss 2 words. Records locked. The response came back in under a minute. Ulrich's contact at Records just tried to access the Vasquez file. Got a security block and an automatic flag. We have him. She put the phone down on the desk. She sat for a moment. The sky through the window at the end of the corridor was doing it fully now. The actual beginning of light. Not the pre-dawn suggestion of it, but the genuine first color of morning coming in low over the building line, gray going to the very pale preliminary shade of blue that preceded everything else. She thought about the specific chain of it. Ulrich to Prescott to a door at 11:51. Prescott to an ICU at 1:14. A phone call to a dead man's family. An anonymous voice on a line telling a mother her son was gone when he wasn't. The specific architecture of a harm that had been built over 14 months and had required, tonight, a night nurse that everyone sent to the waiting room to do her job correctly in order to come apart. The thought was not satisfying in the way that resolution was supposed to be satisfying. It was too complicated for that. The 3 patients before Dario, the ones whose deaths were now part of a federal case, had not had a night like this one. They had not had someone who caught the access log and stood in a supply corridor and called pharmacy before the next shock. They had just died and been grieved, and their files had been quietly managed by people who knew the difference between a complication and a decision. That was the part she sat with. She was still sitting with it when the elevator opened and Tomas Vasquez came off it. He was not in zip cuffs anymore, which meant someone had made a decision about his immediate status. And he was with a woman who was almost certainly a lawyer because she had the specific energy of someone who was managing a situation from the outside and was very good at it. A uniformed officer was behind him, but not close, which was also information. He saw her immediately. He walked toward her and she didn't stand. She was too tired to stand for theatrical reasons. But she turned in her chair and looked at him directly. "They told me," he said. "What you did. Upstairs." "He's stable," she said. "He has a long road, but he's stable." Tomas stood in front of her, and for a moment he didn't seem to know what he wanted to say, which she understood because there was probably no sentence that covered what he was feeling, and people often made the mistake of reaching for one anyway and ending up with something that didn't fit. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For tonight, for all of it." "I know," she said. "That's all? You know? What else do you want me to say?" He thought about it. "I don't know. I thought you'd be angry," she said. "Something," he said. She looked at him. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm going to be angry later, probably. Tonight I'm tired." She paused. "Your brother needs you to stay out of situations like this one. That's the most useful thing I can tell you right now." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he nodded once, the way people nod when they've received something that doesn't feel like enough but is accurate. The lawyer put a hand on his arm and they moved toward the elevator. At 7:15, Voss came to the floor one more time. She sat down across from Mara, and she had a different quality than she'd had all night. Not relaxed, not relieved, but something that was the professional equivalent of those things. The settled quality of someone whose case had crossed a threshold. "Ulrich is in custody," she said. "Arrested at 6:42 at his home. His attorney was already there, which means he saw it coming, but it doesn't matter." She paused. "The records contact is cooperating. Prescott's arraignment is at 10. Based on what we have. The access log, the talk screen, the medical records, the phone call chain. The prosecutor is confident." Mara nodded. "There's something else," Voss said. She waited. "The 3 prior patients," Voss said, "the ones connected to Ulrich's fraud. We've had their files flagged for 14 months, but they were officially closed as natural or procedural deaths. With Prescott in custody and the records freeze in place, the prosecutor is reopening all 3. She paused. "Their families are going to be contacted. There's going to be an official review." Mara looked at the surface of the desk for a moment. "They deserved that 14 months ago," she said. "I know," Voss said. "I know that." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people sitting in the space between what should have happened and what did, which was a specific kind of space that didn't resolve into anything cleaner just because things were moving now. "Your testimony is going to be central to the prosecution's case," Voss said. "Not just the events of tonight. Your clinical observations about Mrs. Tavares, the time stamps, the pattern of Prescott's decisions, the specific nature of what you flagged and when. It establishes the behavioral pattern. It corroborates the documentary evidence." "I'll testify," Mara said. She didn't say it like it was a decision she was making in that moment. It was just a statement of what was going to happen. "Good," Voss said. She stood. She looked at Mara with an expression that was harder to categorize than the ones she'd worn most of the night. Not professional, not quite personal, somewhere in between. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've been doing this 11 years. The moment in the supply corridor where you talked him down, that was the decision point of this entire case. If Marco had fired, or if the tactical team had gone in hard, the whole night looks different. Dario Vasquez is probably dead, Prescott disappears, Ulrich gets another 6 months." Mara looked at her. "I just didn't want him to make things worse," she said. "I know," Voss said. "That's what makes it remarkable." She left. Mara sat at the nurse's station for another 20 minutes while the relief shift fully settled in, finishing the last of the handoff notes with the thoroughness she applied to everything, specific, time-stamped, nothing assumed, and nothing omitted. The floor was returning to its ordinary daytime rhythm, which was louder and brighter and more populated than the night. and she moved through it with the particular invisibility of someone who had been there through the event and was now being absorbed back into the background. At 7:40, she signed out. She went to the locker room and changed out of the scrubs that had blood on them. Not a lot, but enough that she knew what it was and didn't want to walk to her car in them, and stood for a moment in front of the narrow locker that had her name on a piece of tape across the top. The tape was old. The letters had faded to the point where you had to know what it said to read it. She'd put it there the day she started, and nobody had ever replaced it with anything more official. She picked up her bag and walked out. The corridor between the locker room and the main exit was one of the internal corridors that had no windows, and she walked its length at the pace she always walked. Not slow, not fast, just moving. She passed the door to the supply corridor, Chess. Police tape across it still, an officer outside, Chet. And she looked at it as she passed the way. You look at a place where something happened, not stopping, just acknowledging. She pushed through the main doors. The morning hit her differently than she'd expected. Not emotionally. She didn't have a word for what she was expecting, only that what she got was simpler and harder than that. It was cold, the particular sharp cold of very early morning in late autumn, and the sky was fully light now, but the kind of light that hadn't warmed anything yet. And the parking lot had damp leaves against the curb, and a police vehicle she didn't recognize parked at an angle near the entrance, and it smelled like outside, which was the first thing she'd smelled in 10 hours that wasn't the hospital. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk. She was very tired. She was not done. The testimony ahead of her was not nothing, and there were other things she would be asked to do in the coming days that she didn't fully know the shape of yet. But she was done for right now, and she understood the difference between those two things. She was halfway to her car when her phone rang. Unknown number. Not Voss's. Not anyone she'd spoken to tonight. She stopped walking. She looked at the screen. She answered. Ms. Solis. The voice was male, unhurried, with the specific quality of a person who was accustomed to being the one who set the pace of a conversation. My name is Walter Bream. I'm the Regional Director of the Federal Healthcare Oversight Bureau. I apologize for the hour. She said nothing. I've been briefed on the events at Harrow Vale tonight, Bream said, and on your role in them, specifically on the clinical judgment you exercised regarding the Vasquez patient and the records freeze that prevented the destruction of evidence. A pause. I've also reviewed your service record, the portions that are available. Most of it isn't, she said. I know. I made some calls. Another pause, and in the quality of it, she understood that he had made calls to places that were not easily called. Ms. Solis, we have a problem in this region that tonight's events have made significantly clearer. Garrett Ulrich operated within a licensing oversight system that should have caught him and didn't. Nolan Prescott operated in a clinical environment that should have had better safeguards and didn't. And 3 patients died who might not have died if there had been someone in those systems asking the right questions at the right time. She was standing in the parking lot in the cold. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. What are you telling me? She said. I'm telling you that I'm going to be building a regional oversight task force in the coming months, Bream said. A small team, clinical background required, security clearance required. The mandate is to identify systemic failures in licensed medical facilities before they produce body counts. He paused. Your name came up from 3 different sources before 6 o'clock this morning. She looked at the hospital entrance across the parking lot. The police tape. The early light on the glass. I'm a nurse, she said. I know what you are, Bream said. That's why I'm calling. She stood in the parking lot and the wind moved the leaves along the curb, and she held the phone against her ear and thought about navy blue scrubs and a stain near the left pocket and a tape label on a locker that had faded to the point of illegibility. Send me the details, she said. She hung up. She walked the rest of the way to her car, unlocked it, sat down, and put both hands on the wheel. She did not start it immediately. She sat for a moment in the quiet of a cold car in a parking lot in early morning, and she let herself be tired, and she let the night be what it was, which was large and specific and not finished, not remotely, but in motion. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from Voss. Hospital administration is being briefed at 9 a.m. Your name is going to come up. Thought you should know. She read it twice. Then she started the car. She was pulling out of the parking lot when she saw, in the rearview mirror, that Deborah was standing at the main entrance, coat on, shift clearly over, about to walk to her own car. She wasn't looking toward Mara's car. She was standing still for a moment, the way you stand still when you've come out of something large, and the outside is a small shock, and then she started walking. Mara watched her in the mirror until she turned out of the lot onto the main road. She drove home in the early light, and she did not think about the meeting at 9, or the testimony, or Walter Bream, and the thing he was going to send her details about. She thought about Bernard Fike, who had been sitting in a waiting room since 8 o'clock, and had looked at her like someone who had been waiting to be spoken to. She thought about whether he'd been admitted or discharged, and whether he had someone who would take him home, and whether she'd remembered to note in the chart that he lived alone, which was a detail that mattered for follow-up. She hadn't noted it. She filed it as something to call in when she was less tired. She was 4 blocks from her apartment when her phone rang again. Not Bream, not Voss, but the hospital's main line, which was unusual enough that she pulled over. Ms. Solis. It was an administrative voice, the particular vocal quality of someone reading from a script they hadn't written. This is the Harrow Vale Administrative Office. We're calling to inform you that effective immediately, Dr. Prescott's overnight attending responsibilities are suspended pending investigation, and the Chief Medical Officer has requested a meeting with you at your earliest convenience to discuss. I'll call back, she said, and hung up, because she was 4 blocks from her apartment and she was not having that conversation from a parked car on a residential street. She drove the last 4 blocks. She parked. She picked up her bag. She walked to her door and put the key in the lock and opened it, and inside it was the same as it always was. Quiet, orderly, with the coffee maker on the counter, and the particular stillness of a place where someone lives alone and has arranged it precisely to their own requirements. And none of that had changed, which was the thing about places. They didn't know what you'd been doing while you were gone. She set her bag down. She filled the coffee maker, which took 7 minutes, and while it ran, she sat on the edge of her couch in the specific, inelegant way of someone whose body had been upright for 22 hours and no longer had the energy for posture. And she looked at the wall opposite and thought about nothing with great concentration, which was not as easy as it sounded. Her phone was on the cushion beside her. At 8:43 a.m., it buzzed with a message from a number she now recognized as Voss's. One more thing you should know before the 9 a.m. meeting. Prescott gave a statement. She picked up the phone. He said it was Ulrich's network that approached him, said he was coerced, gave names, 16 names across 5 facilities in 3 counties. She read it twice. 16, she read again. She set the phone down on her knee and sat in the quiet of her apartment with the coffee maker finishing its cycle on the counter. And she thought about 16 names across 5 facilities and what that meant in terms of the number of patients, the number of charts, the number of people who had sat in waiting rooms or lain in monitored beds or been told by someone with a credential and a coat that what was happening to them was unavoidable. She thought about what Walter Bream had said on the phone. Identify systemic failures before they produce body counts. She picked up the phone again. She found Voss's contact and typed, I need the names of the 3 prior patients, the ones connected to Ulrich, for the testimony. She paused. And I need someone to check on Bernard Fike, admitted last night, possible MI. He lives alone. Make sure there's a follow-up note in his chart. She sent both messages. She went and poured the coffee. She was standing at her kitchen counter with the cup in her hands, not quite drinking it yet, just holding the warmth of it, when her phone rang for the 4th time that morning. This time it was a number she didn't recognize, and something in the prefix, the area code, the exchange, made her go very still before she answered. Solis, said the voice on the other end. She knew the voice. She had not heard it in 3 years, and she would not have been able to describe it in advance. But she knew it immediately in the way you knew certain things that had been stored somewhere below conscious retrieval. Colonel, she said. I heard about last night, said Colonel Adrian Thau, who had been her commanding officer from 2019 to 2022, and whose voice on a telephone at 8:45 in the morning was not a social call and had never been a social call. All of it, from 2 different sources. Mara waited. There's a federal oversight position being assembled in your region, Thau said. Bream's office. He's going to offer it to you. He already did, Mara said. A pause. He moves fast, Thau said, with a quality in her voice that was almost but not quite approval. I'm calling because I want you to know that if you take it, there's a portion of the mandate that connects to work we're still doing on the military medical side. Coordination across civilian and defense healthcare systems. There's a specific gap that Bream's team can't fill alone. Another pause, shorter. I can't say more than that on an unsecured line. I know, Mara said, but I wanted you to hear it from me before you made any decisions. She stood at her kitchen counter with the coffee going cold in her hands and the morning light coming through the window over the sink. And she thought about the tape on her locker that had faded to illegibility, and the chart queue at the nurse's station, and the specific weight of 2 years of being sent to manage the waiting room. I'll read what Bream sends me, she said. That's all I'm asking, Thao said. She hung up. She stood in the quiet of her apartment for another moment. Then she drank the coffee, even though it had gone cold because she'd been up for 22 hours, and cold coffee was still coffee. And she did not have the patience this morning for the kind of person who only drinks things at the right temperature. She was rinsing the cup when her phone buzzed one last time. Not Voss, not Thao, not Bream. It was the Harrowvale administrative line again, and this time she answered it, because she was in her apartment and she had coffee in her system and she was capable of having the conversation now. Ms. Solis, said the administrative voice, the chief medical officer has asked me to convey that the hospital board is convening an emergency session this morning and your presence has been formally requested. A pause. And Dr. Okafor asked me to pass along a personal message. What message? She said. The voice read from what was clearly a handwritten note, slightly uncertain about a word in the middle. He said, Mrs. Tavares is asking for her nurse. Thought you should know who she was asking for. Mara stood in her kitchen. Tell Dr. Okafor I'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. She hung up. She looked at the cold tap running over the rinsed cup in the sink, and she turned it off, and she set the cup on the drying rack, and she went to get her other set of scrubs, because the ones she'd come home in were not the kind you went back in. She was lacing her shoes when her phone screen lit up with a news alert, local, a breaking banner from the Keswick County News Service. Harrowvale Medical Center, hospital administrator and senior county official arrested in overnight federal operation. Multiple facilities under review. She read the first line of the article. She put the phone in her pocket and picked up her bag. She opened the door, and the cold morning came in, and she walked into it. The drive back took 38 minutes instead of 40 because the morning traffic hadn't fully built yet, and she used the time the way she used most time that didn't require her active attention. Thinking through the sequence of what was coming, not planning exactly, more like reading the terrain ahead before she was in it. The board meeting. Mrs. Tavares. Whatever Bream's documentation looked like when it arrived. The testimony, which was not going to be a single conversation, but a process that would take weeks and would require her to sit in rooms with lawyers and prosecutors and say the same things she'd said to the federal recorder at 4 in the morning, except more formally and with more at stake. She had done harder things. She parked in the same spot she always used, third row from the main entrance on the left, because it was close enough to be practical and far enough from the entrance that she'd never once had trouble finding it. Small logistical constants were underrated. She'd learned that in environments where nothing else was constant, and you took the small ones where you found them. The main entrance had new tape on the outer doors. Caution tape, not police. The facilities kind. The result of the shattered glass from the night before. Someone had put plywood over the lowest panels and propped a handwritten sign beside the door that said, "Use side entrance," with an arrow. The handwriting was Tobias's, but she recognized the particular quality of it from intake forms. She went in the side entrance. The lobby was different in daylight. Not different in any literal sense. The same chairs, the same overhead lights, the same cable news channel on the corner television, which was still playing to nobody in particular, but different in the way all places were different when you'd last seen them under extreme conditions and returned to find them restored to their ordinary dimensions. Smaller. More comprehensible. She took the elevator to 3. Mrs. Tavares was awake. She was sitting up in the cardiac bed with the monitoring lead still attached and a breakfast tray on the swing table that she hadn't touched. And when Mara came through the door, she looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been told something about the person in front of them and is reconciling it with the person they thought they knew. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," Mara said. She came to the bedside, checked the monitor out of habit before she'd made a conscious decision to, ran her eyes across the readings. Better. Significantly better. The night had done what the medication and monitoring were supposed to do, and the cardiac picture on the screen was not normal. It would not be normal for some time, but it was a thing that could be worked with rather than raced against. "The nurses this morning told me what happened," Mrs. Tavares said. "Downstairs." "Some of it," Mara said. "They know some of it. They said you kept a man alive on the floor." She paused, and then went into a corridor alone. "I wasn't alone," Mara said, which was true in the technical sense, and she'd decided that the technical sense was the one she was going to use for this particular account. Mrs. Tavares looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality of a woman who had lived long enough to know when someone was giving her the edited version. "The doctor," she said. "The one they arrested this morning. He was here last night." "Yes." "He looked at my chart at 9:30, she said. "He didn't change anything. He just looked and walked away." Mara kept her face level. "I know." "You flagged me 3 times, Mrs. Tavares said. "I saw the notes this morning. The overnight nurse showed me." Her voice had a quality that was not quite accusation and not quite gratitude, but something in the complicated space between them. "3 times you said I needed more attention, and 3 times he didn't act." "Yes," Mara said. "You weren't wrong." "No," Mara said. "I wasn't." They sat in that for a moment. There was no good way to dress it up, and she didn't try. Mrs. Tavares had a right to know that someone had seen what was happening to her and had said so, and that the person who should have acted had chosen not to, and that the choosing had not been carelessness or oversight, but something colder and more deliberate. She also had a right to not receive that information from the person who'd flagged her at 10 p.m. while sitting in a cardiac bed the morning after. So Mara gave her the shape of it without the weight of it, which was the best she could do right now. "You're going to be here for a few more days," Mara said. "Dr. Okafor is a good physician. You're in the right hands." Mrs. Tavares looked at the untouched breakfast tray and then back at her. "Are you going to keep working here?" she said. Mara looked at her. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the honest answer. She gave the honest answer. She left Mrs. Tavares with the breakfast tray and the monitor and the morning light coming through the window of the cardiac room, and she took the elevator down to the administrative floor, which she had visited exactly twice in 2 years for paperwork and HR reasons, and which had the particular carpeted quiet of a floor that dealt in decisions rather than emergencies. The board had assembled in the main conference room. She knew because the door was closed and there were voices behind it, and the administrative assistant outside it, a woman named Peggy, who had worked this floor for longer than anyone, and who possessed the particular competence of someone who had seen administrations come and go and found all of them somewhat manageable, looked up when Mara approached and said simply, "They're waiting for you." She went in. There were 8 people at the table. She recognized the chief medical officer, Dr. Sylvia Krantz, who she had met once at an all-staff meeting and who had the particular focused bearing of a physician who had moved into administration without losing the clinical habits, which Mara took as a moderately good sign. The others were hospital board members, and one person she didn't recognize who was introduced as legal counsel retained since 6 that morning. She sat down. Krantz looked at her for a moment before speaking, and the look had something in it that was not the way administrators usually looked at night shift nurses, which was with the specific half-attention of people who were not quite certain why they were in the same room. "Ms. Solis," she said, "I want to start by saying that what you did last night, the clinical decisions, the coordination with the federal team, and specifically your intervention in the ICU, likely saved Dario Vasquez's life and materially contributed to the arrest of 2 individuals who have caused serious harm to patients in this institution and others." She paused. "I also want to acknowledge, on behalf of this administration, that you flagged Mrs. Tavares 3 times before she was appropriately escalated, and that your clinical assessment was correct each time, and that you were systematically redirected away from that patient by a physician who, we now understand, had reasons to create procedural distance from certain cases." The room was very quiet. "That's an institutional failure," Krantz said, "and I want to name it directly." Mara sat with that. She had not expected an apology. Not in those terms, not at a board table at 9 in the morning on the day after everything. She had expected something more procedural, more qualified, the kind of language that legal counsel shaped to be accurate without being adhesive. What Krantz had given her instead was specific, and specificity was the thing that mattered, because specificity meant someone had understood what had actually happened and was willing to say it in a room where it would be documented. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough for all of it, and she knew Krantz knew it was not enough for all of it, and they both sat in that knowledge without pretending it was otherwise, which was the right way to handle things that didn't fully resolve. The legal counsel, whose name she caught as Adkins, leaned forward. "We're initiating a full internal review of all cases Dr. Prescott attended over the past 3 years. We're also reviewing the administrative relationship between this institution and the Keswick County Licensing Board, specifically as it relates to Garrett Ulrich's access and influence." He paused. "The Federal Oversight Bureau has requested cooperation, and we've committed to full transparency." She listened to the rest of it, the procedural landscape, the timeline of the review, the patient notification process for the 3 prior cases that were now under federal reopening, and she asked the questions that needed asking, and she gave the information they needed that she hadn't already given to the federal recorder. And the meeting ran 40 minutes and ended with Krantz walking her to the door personally, which was not something chief medical officers usually did. "I want to ask you something directly," Krantz said in the corridor, with Peggy out of earshot. "Okay," Mara said. "Walter Bream's office called me at 7:30 this morning. They're building a regional oversight team. He told me he'd reached out to you." "He did," Mara said. "I'm not going to ask you what you're planning to do," Krantz said. "But I want you to know that if you stay here, things will be different. The structural things, how clinical concerns are escalated, how night shift observations are weighted. I'm committed to changing them. Not because of what happened last night, or not only because of it, because they should have been different before." Mara looked at her. "I appreciate that," she said. She meant it. She wasn't certain yet what she was going to do, and she told Krantz that, and Krantz accepted it with the quality of someone who had learned that the honest answer was better than the comfortable one. She walked out of the administrative floor and took the stairs instead of the elevator because she needed the transition. The news, when it came out fully over the following weeks, was larger than even Voss's text at 8:43 had suggested. Garrett Ulrich was charged with medical fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and 3 counts of criminal negligence causing death. The 3 prior patients who had died in circumstances that looked like complications and were now being reconstructed, record by record, as decisions. Nolan Prescott was charged with attempted murder in the 2nd degree, conspiracy, and accessory after the fact to medical fraud. His cooperation with the prosecution, the 16 names, the 5 facilities, the 3 counties, was entered into the record, and the prosecutor noted it without softening what he had done, because cooperation was a legal calculation, not absolution. The trial proceedings began 4 months later. Mara testified twice, once at the preliminary hearing, once at the main proceeding. She gave her testimony the same way she gave everything, specifically without performance, looking at the prosecutor, and then at the jury, and not at the defense table, because looking at the defense table was information the defense wanted from her, and she saw no reason to give them what they wanted. When she described flagging Mrs. Tavares 3 times, someone in the gallery made a sound. She didn't track it, she kept talking. Prescott received 11 years. His attorney had argued for substantial reduction given the cooperation, and the judge had disagreed in terms that were unusually direct for a sentencing decision. The phrase the local news pulled for their coverage was, "The cooperation mitigates the risk but does not diminish the harm," which she read on her phone in her car on the day the sentence came down and sat with for several minutes. Ulrich received 17 years. He was 61 years old. The families of the 3 prior patients were notified, and their cases were formally reclassified, and 2 of the 3 families filed civil suits against the Medical Licensing Board. She followed it from a distance. She did not know the families, but she knew the general shape of what they were living through. The specific disorientation of being told that the thing you believed was one thing was in fact another thing, and that the machinery that should have protected someone had instead been turned against them. And she thought about them without being able to do anything directly useful about their grief, which was the particular frustration of caring about something you couldn't fix. She left Harrow Vale on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after the trial began. She gave 4 weeks' notice, which was more than required, and she worked every shift of those 4 weeks at the same pace she always had. And on the last night, Deborah brought a cake to the breakroom that said Mara in block letters and blue icing, which was the closest thing to a grand gesture that a night shift breakroom at 2 in the morning could produce. And she ate a slice of it and talked to the people she'd worked alongside for 2 years, and did not make a speech because she had never been the kind of person who made speeches. She started with the Federal Healthcare Oversight Bureau in January. The work was different. Not easier, different. It was investigative rather than clinical, systemic rather than individual, and it required a different kind of attention than standing at a bedside reading a monitor. But the underlying thing, the reading of situations, the identification of what was happening underneath what appeared to be happening, the capacity to move toward the problem rather than away from it while everyone else was still deciding what the problem was, that was the same. That had always been the same. Colonel Tao had been right about the coordination with the military medical side, and the nature of that work was still largely undisclosed, but it existed, and it mattered, and Mara did it. She thought sometimes about what the work actually was. Not in terms of its formal mandate, she knew the formal mandate, she could recite it, but in terms of what it required from the person doing it. It required the capacity to look at something that everyone around you had categorized as settled, and ask whether that categorization was accurate. It required the willingness to say so when the answer was no. It required the specific tolerance for being dismissed, for being redirected, for having your flags treated as noise, without letting that treatment become the final word. She had been in training for this her entire career without knowing what it was training her for. That was the thing about the quiet work. The work done by people in the background of other people's emergencies, by the ones in the corner chairs and the night shifts and the waiting rooms, by the ones who flag things 3 times and document everything and show up anyway. It did not announce itself. It did not generate the kind of visibility that got acknowledged in real time. But it accumulated and it held, and when the moment came that required it to be more than quiet, it was there. Fully. Completely. Without the delay of someone who had to first understand what they were capable of. 4 months into the new role, she received a letter. Handwritten, which was unusual. Return address was a county correctional facility in the next district. She almost didn't open it. She read the return address twice, and then she opened it anyway. The handwriting was careful. The handwriting of someone who was not accustomed to letters and was taking deliberate care with it. Miss Solis. My name is Tomas Vasquez. I don't know if you remember me. You told me outside the ER that Dario was alive, and you told me he needed me to stay out of situations like that night. I want you to know I'm trying. I have 18 months in a county facility for criminal trespass and weapons charges, and the DA recommended the reduced charge partly because of what you told the federal agent in your statement, that I put the weapon down and cooperated and didn't raise it again. I don't know if you knew what that would mean for my case, but I thought you should know what it meant. Dario is out of the ICU. He's in rehab for his shoulder. He testified last month and he called me after and he sounded okay. I wanted to say thank you. I know that's not enough for what that night was. But I didn't know what else to send. She read it standing at her kitchen counter on a Saturday morning with the coffee maker running behind her. She read it twice. Then she found a piece of paper and a pen, which took longer than it should have because she didn't write letters often, and she wrote back. She told him she remembered. She told him that what he'd done in the supply corridor, putting the weapon down, was a harder thing than it looked because it required him to make a decision against momentum, against the whole weight of what had already been set in motion, and most people didn't manage that. She told him that Dario was going to need him to be someone different when he got out, and that being someone different was work, not intention, and that the difference between those two things was everything. She didn't tell him she hoped things would work out. She didn't know if they would, but she sealed the letter and sent it because he had taken the time to write honestly, and honesty deserved a response. The work continued. The 5 facilities under review produced findings that were uncomfortable for several people in several positions of authority, and the findings were documented and forwarded to the appropriate oversight bodies. And in 3 of the 5 cases, they resulted in disciplinary proceedings that were quiet and procedural and did not make the news, but that mattered to the patients they protected. That was the nature of prevention. It was invisible in the way that all things that didn't happen were invisible. And you had to be able to do the work without requiring it to be seen, because most of it never would be. She was fine with that. She had always been fine with that. What she hadn't always understood, what she'd spent 2 years in Navy scrubs not fully understanding, was that the invisibility was a choice, not something done to her. A choice she had made and could revise. The quiet was real. She was not a different person than the one who had sat at that nurse's station for 2 years and documented everything and flagged things that went unread. But the quiet was not the whole of it. The quiet was where she did the work. The recognition, when it came, was not the reason for the work. It was just the evidence that the work had been real. She had walked toward gunfire on a Tuesday night in autumn in a pair of scrubs with a coffee stain on the left pocket, not because she was trying to prove something, but because she could see clearly what was happening and what needed to happen next, and there was no one else positioned to do it. That was all it had ever been. That, it turned out, was enough. On a Thursday in late spring, 6 months into the new role, she was in a conference room in the federal building doing an intake review on a case file when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that resolved, when she looked at the preview, into something she recognized as a news alert forward from Voss. The headline read, "Ulrich conviction upheld on appeal. 17-year sentence stands." Below it, Voss had added 4 words. "Thought you'd want to know." She set the phone face down on the conference table and looked at the case file in front of her. She thought about the 3 patients she'd never met and never would. She thought about the specific quality of a harm that ran for 14 months through a system designed to prevent it. She thought about what it required to be a person who looks at that system and decides to make it work differently. Not the dramatic version of that, not the version that happened in a single night with gunfire and federal badges, but the long version, the daily version, the version made of documentation and flags, and showing up for a shift that nobody was watching and doing the work correctly anyway. She picked up the case file. She turned to the next page. Outside the conference room window, the city was doing what cities did in late spring, alive with the particular energy of a place that had been cold for a long time and was now warm. And the light on the building across the street was direct and clear, and the kind of light that made things look exactly like what they were. She read the next page. She kept going.